Okay, I think in the last recording I failed pretty hard by wanting to talk about something novel and interesting and exciting that I wanted to talk about in my head, and I wasn't very good at just explaining some basic things here. So let me just think if I can get a list of things to somewhat revise and talk about here. So, I did explain these things over here. One is called the question, and the other one is called the just itself. Oh, and there were some other things about this inferior function which I brought up, and there were more things that I probably should have added, which are more interesting. So I think that this inferior function, although I was trying to sort of deign sort of ignorance about ambiguity, but I actually think that this inferior function is, in Scientology there's a phrase called free theta. I think that this inferior function is basically the resource of embodies the resource of free theta. Whatever responsibility you have to operate is essentially here, and I think that essentially the fact that you are trapped within the false ego complex, the structure, or with, let's just say rather, without integrating this inferior function with this dominant function, that has to do with keeping the ego with under the spell of the sin of the ego, essentially, and it requires a kind of complicity, some complicit buy-in from the inferior function. And I think, I mean, it's not written on this diagram, but what I would call that is that the secret devotion, essentially. That I think that this inferior function is a free operator. It is unbound by the structures. It is wholly left on its own in some sense. And the sin of the ego is put on its own from the perspective of the parent function. The superego's parent function gets to somewhat dictate the sin of the ego, and the ego just has to sort of buy into it, but not the inferior function. The inferior function can kind of be the revolutionary, but it has to do the revolutionary act of taking ultimate responsibility for the sin of the ego, so it can basically hopscotch over that, hopscotch over the sort of child function that is accusing it, which I think might archetypally be connected to the Whore of Babylon, and then it can kind of retrieve the blood of the saints, which is stuck in the mortar of Babylon the Great, because this is going to be actually the material for the new Jerusalem is going to be reclaimed here, essentially, when this can amalgamate with this as a pseudo child function that can just step over this sore spot, and leaving that alone in the first place to establish some power base over here, to then eventually in the end defeat this 1,000 years into the future, after all the frogs of the dragons and the false prophets and the beasts of all these have all been ironed out. So that's basically just reiterating my model of self-actualization here. Anyway, so let me just talk about some basic things here. So what is this just itself? And so this is also what breaks the second circuit. That the devotion, declaration, worship, oath goes into a contiguous circuit where it's connected up with itself, whereas this is a broken circuit with that, in some sense, the unconscious parent function and the superego parent function are both independent powerhouses, and this is, this was the one of the core underlying themes that sort of the Metatype has been very, very early in my work, and this was put into the plot of the Matrix movies. Or this is perhaps a big claim to make, but I can at least use it as a useful metaphor here. That this is like the oracle in the Matrix movies. This parent function. Because the oracle, or the parent function of the unconscious side of the mind, is essentially the farthest most outpost of the superego parent function, which you could basically say is sort of the machine world. This is kind of like the architect that you never sort of see, and this is maybe the actual leader of the machines in the kind of physical form, but this is the architect, and this is the oracle, and kind of need both the insights here, and you have to get them to sort of give up their frogs of the false prophets and get that synthesized nicely, but these can be the hardest ones to reach, to synthesize that into the responsibility of the inferior function, because they kind of you have to work on that by amalgamating the inferior function and the parent function, which means that there can't be sort of any kind of cognitive dissonance held in the dominant function either. Because the vanity, or the dominant function, I sometimes call the vanity, which I think is being referred to as the unclean spirit, or of the dragon. In some sense, this is the thing you could be said is holding the unclean spirit, and this is the thing that needs to be sort of cleansed, so that it can be in a state that it can become a pseudo child function. But anyway. So that these things have the power collectively to actually take responsibility for the sin in such a way that they can actually defeat the sin or overcome it. But in some sense, I think that this is the actual cause of the sin. Although this is distributed into all the structures here, but this is sort of the actual theme, and you can't fix this until you fix the actual manifestation of it in those other structures. Anyway, because this is too mysterious, and you have to expend the mystery in the other structures first. So in some sense, this is the earliest cause of the problem, because in some sense the superego is the source of the whole problem, and this is the deepest thing that is the source of the problem in the superego. So everything sort of, this is the primal hurt or something, and then sort of the sin becomes a kind of sacred contract, which the inferior function, the ego, just kind of gets inducted into at the start, and maybe sort of becomes nescient, or sort of gets mesmerized at some point, and then it actually has to realize that it needs to indict itself to take more responsibility for even the whole structure, which is sort of problem of sort of backtracking all these things, because they get really lost in so many sort of things. They get lost primarily also because of this question over here. I'm somewhat going to make some predictions about the next Matrix movie, although I don't know about the contents of the next Matrix movie, but I can sort of hope about its contents, perhaps. That the thing here is that if you can watch the Matrix movie the first three Matrix movies slightly cynically, that that whose side is the Oracle really on? Because she's one of the machine people. She's a program herself. She's perhaps a sentient program, but she's still a program. So who is a true master in some sense? Who does she truly serve? She really likes her special children. She wants to make, she promotes them. She's got questions for them maybe. But there was an interesting question which Neo got to see beyond, because Neo interacted with someone that wasn't plugged into the Matrix. He interacted with one of the elders in Zion, which was one of the first people rescued from the Matrix, from the previous one. And he goes and he takes Neo out and he says, "Look at all the machines here," and he asks Neo some question, and Neo says, "Well, what's your answer to the question?" And he says, I don't have an answer, I only have a question, what's the point, And I wonder if that was a different kind of parent function in the unconscious side of the mind to the oracle, if that maybe changed the oracle's plan, or changed the calculation, because you can imagine that perhaps the oracle is just promoting the right impetus, the right structure. Because in some sense, the question is the oracle completely independent of the superego's parent function? And that all really has to do with the state of the inferior function of the subconscious, or the foundation of the unconscious. And you can say that maybe this was the wrestling over the eyes of the oracle between the prayer and the answer. I should talk about these things. So these are kind of like mock, just trying to use very rich language that can be a good metaphor. When I go into these sorts of details, the language, I think, will make more sense. But to start to contextualize it now, I can just talk about, sort of what these different ambits of the different sides of the mind entail. That's probably what I should have started with as well. So essentially, the superego, in some sense, I think, is the most direct, immediate sense of reality. It's what you are doing. It's very active. And most of the time, the more people are sort of trapped in the false ego complex, the superego becomes a kind of environmental unconsciousness that you just expect that the context is built in. And in some sense, this is just because of the subconscious almost innately displaces the appreciation of the superego. Like the subconscious and the superego, or any overlapping side of the mind, are usually quite anathema to one another. Whereas sides of the mind that are one apart, like the subconscious and the ego, they reinforce each other. You can also see that structurally between the worship and the oath. So the ego and the subconscious have an affinity for one another, and the superego and the unconscious have a natural affinity for one another. They're kind of on the same circuit, they're on the same team to some degree, or that's who they have to kind of cozy to in some sense. And this bias is a development, it has an ontological root. That is just the natural propensity of development, because it's easier to ignore your inferior function than to integrate with it, especially when you have support coming or a natural connection which has to be supported by the general structure. So your dominant function and your parent function is going to try to make friends with the other dominant function and parent function before it tries to integrate with its own local inferior function. So you're going to perhaps have a structure of collusion. Sorry, with my cursor I was probably kind of pointing at the wrong thing. So there's going to be a kind of structure of collusion between these two and these two, that the ego's dominance and parent is going to have a collusion with the subconscious dominance and parent, and the unconscious dominance and parent is going to have a collusion with the superego's dominance and parent. But the unconscious is more estranged from itself because it's only connected on one side, and it's only connected in terms of the superego is connected to the unconscious foundation. So in some sense the unconscious has just an input from the superego, whereas the output of the unconscious is being fed into the inferior function in the ego, which would, this would be the one, or neo would be symbolized by the inferior function in the ego. Okay, and as you can see, this link here I call question, or the question. And in some sense, the question is, the reason why I call it the question, if I can remember exactly all the things about this, is that the question is the latest mystery of the narrative of the sum problem of consciousness, in some sense, because this is what whatever free attention units you have in your head to think about things, why am I not self-actualized? Why this? Why that? Or something like that. Well, maybe you're not even asking the deep metaphysical questions or the deep sort of meta-ethical questions about your own self. But so the state of this question might be completely unquested, perhaps, sort of you're not even thinking about this question, is sidelined. But at some point, people, I think, are going to have the question is either going to be answered with an excuse, perhaps, or the question is going to be vague and kind of that you're not going to. This, I think, could also be considered to be the spiritual need, like, are you mindful of your own spiritual need? Like, how do you actually grapple with this question, or do you banish the question? And in some sense, I think that there's a kind of, what I've tried to say, that there's a secret devotion, that you see, although it doesn't structurally, it's not, the secret devotion, I think, is internal to this thing. It's not connected with something else. You could say that the secret devotion by default is going to have an implicit sympathy with the superego child function, just because the superego child function is the principal source of value in the entire structure. And in some sense, the question at its deepest core is questioning the value of that child function, because this is the source of paradox. This is the source of existential sort of disquiet. Why am I stuck in this structure? Why am I captive to the false ego complex, essentially? Okay, so that, I think, is the sort of the implicit question. But in some sense, the question even might be framed in a diverting question, that you're diverting yourself by asking irrelevant questions because you are stuck in some sympathy with the superego child function. But approximately, you might be interested in learning about some other child function here, or this question could just be anything. It could, but I think that also the question is, so in another way of describing this, because this might be actually a bit too deep, the question you could say is found within here. This is also why I name metatypes after this, because more obviously, if I told you that your metatype was thematically structured around this dominant function, you would be startled by that, because you would say, that's a funny thing to say, because I actually think that I'm bad at that, but on reflection, it's interesting, it's strange. That would be a strange thing to say. But if I told you that your false ego complex was obsessed or thematically linked with this, you would agree. Because that is the source, that is one of the, sort of the prime source of your question. That's the prime ingredient where the question gets spun in the latest iteration of the question. So anyway, so this is in Revelations, they talk about the baby and the dragon, and the baby is taken by a woman on a dragon to go be born. A woman with child is spirited away or something like that by a dragon, and I think that that is somewhat related here, although it doesn't exactly maybe line up. But in some sense, I think the woman is maybe symbolizing this over here, that this is being reverse engineered and reborn, because this is going to be a kind of a catalyst for being able to refine this question into aggregating responsibility within the inferior function. Because you want a new child to be born, and so you need to have a woman, an oracle, go away with the dragon and produce a new child, in some sense. Produce a new sin. You need to understand that the unconsciousness has a very particular kind of sin, so that you can precipitate a new sort of project within the ego. And so in some sense, I think that the woman being taken away by the dragon to have a new child, that is also in the Matrix movies what was being explained by the old man in Zion speaking to Neo and saying, what's the point of making points? What is the point? That's kind of putting the unconsciousness on its head, because you can get really drunk on the unconscious. The unconscious is anyway. So let me talk about these sides of the mind again now. So I keep on breaking it by talking about these little mechanics, but I think that can be interesting to learn it simultaneously. Maybe it works. Okay, the superego is maybe one of the hardest ones to understand, because it's the most sort of ephemeral and strange as well. It's fundamentally alien to us. We understand the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego. It's much more natural than the superego. Superego is somewhat shrouded by these structures ordinarily. Okay, the subconscious, I think people will be very familiar with the subconscious. So what I mean by B, I was very helped by John Vervaeke's 4 Ps, and the perspectival. You see, like, yeah. So I mean, you can just see that how I language things and how other people sort of categorize them. Maybe, although I mean, maybe maybe he wouldn't want to have my work associated with his. In any way, but so my understanding of what the subconscious is you have to have an identity within a framework of a perspective. So when I say identity, I mean your sense of how you be, or what you be, or something like that. Now, in some sense, this is more how you be, not what you be. What you be, in some sense, is a product of the ego. You have propositional judgments about what you be. So the ego and the subconscious are almost interchangeable because the one feeds the other. So you have propositions about what you be, and then how you be is the container in which that you can infuse a foundation of how you can have more propositions. So you have propositions based on already your framing, your perspective framing, which is I'm saying that the framework of how you have perspectives amounts to how you be. So your subconscious is your sense of be, and your ego is your sense of the judgments that you have, which in some sense presuppose the subconscious. This is why the subconscious, when it is first birthed, is so, I would even say, incredibly maniacally dishonest, because it has no substance. It is literally constructed from a set of rule books. It is constructed, I believe, from almost the parent function backwards. And I think I've got some recordings where I talk about how the oath, it actually has to have a virtual oath to almost start it out. And that the virtual oath will have a direct reflection on what I was just talking about earlier when I talked about the secret devotion. It will leave a kind of blemish in the secret devotion, because you know from the start that the ego is structured as a lie, essentially, but a necessary fiction. So, you start the ego as a game, but then the game becomes essentially a bear trap. But anyway, that's part of my developmental kind of model of things. But I think that all the developmental stuff that I've said on this topic, it still stands pretty decently. I don't think I've made any basic revisions to that. Anyway, so the perspectival. Okay, so the interesting thing about the perspectival is that it's a hodgepodge. It's not going to be like you have one framework. And in some sense, this is why some people can have dissociative identities, or DID, dissociative identity disorder, etc., and perhaps even split personalities and things like that. It's probably because they're going to have unconscious triggers, or even egoic triggers that perhaps also work with the unconscious to some degree, that channel different frameworks. But I mean, people naturally have more than one framework. They naturally have more than one identity in that sense. They have a different identity for each different friend they have, for each different association or organizational affiliation that they have. So, people wear different hats, and they just subconsciously channel those frameworks. And in some sense, they, I believe, are constructed out of the ego first. The ego builds the subconscious brick by brick, but some of those bricks have got holes in the mortar, or holes in the masonry, and some of those bricks are, sort of misshapen into very unhelpful or sort of incongruent structures. And so you've got perhaps structures that are intersecting one another, that are like a Venn diagram. And so now I think that part of what narcissism is, and this is just a slight aside, is that the subconscious exists, but it exists very differently to ordinary people. Whereas ordinary people will have an ego interface with their subconscious, which will be somewhat organic. It'll go sort of both ways, push and pull, tug and sort of feedback, tug and sort of and propitiation. That is a kind of two-way street between the ego and the subconscious. I think that essentially the subconscious in the narcissist is kind of like a crater. it's like a virtual domain, and it's been completely subverted by the unconscious, and the ego only wants to manipulate the unconscious essentially. And so the ego has worked out a way in which it can sort of bastardize the subconscious so that it can try to sort of gang up on the unconscious, that it can kind of play a manipulation game on both sides of the unconscious side of the mind, something like that. And that's because there's essentially within the independent, within the dominant and parent function of the unconscious, there's a kind of there's a contradiction there. There's a cognitive dissonance, but essentially there is this idea to make an amalgamated, what I would, Sam Buckland talks about introjective objects. I think that essentially that is perhaps where the introjective paradigm is housed. And in some sense, the idea is that this is supposed to be an equivalent of the superego. This is a way to experience the pure holistic sort of Unitarian pristineness of the superego, to try to, because in some sense narcissists are people who, when they develop their ego, and then they should have started developing their subconscious, and then should have moved on to having a healthy unconscious, which would help sort of create an organic, sort of fluid, or at least loose relays of communication between the subconscious, unconscious, and ego. The narcissist never let go of the superego and used it as a kind of guiding North Star, perhaps also having some disruption in their home environment, in their having a kind of traumatic environment, which already then predisposed them to needing to work around their developmentally impoverished inability to properly establish a subconscious, unconscious frame of reference. So, sorry, I'm talking all over the place, but yeah, perhaps I shouldn't be talking about narcissism as well right now. But let me just say that the subconscious itself will also have a model of each other side of the mind. Like, that's another important thing, is that the main three sides of the mind, which are the subconscious, unconscious, and ego, I believe in some sense know about each other quite well. Superego is kind of in a different category, because the superego is kind of like, I think, the hidden power behind the curtain. It's the Wizard of Oz, or it's the man behind the curtain. Whereas the narcissist sort of is trying to play the Wizard of Oz. Anyway, because so, that's an interesting angle, but anyway, let me not get too diverted. So, so the subconscious, I think, not necessarily, but I think in a healthy mind that's capable of self-reflection, what that definitionally means is that the subconscious has a kind of also, I think what I've just said is that these sides of the mind model each other, or can, let's say, have an internal understanding of each other. That might also just be what it means to have an integrated inferior function, or a more integrated inferior function. Because in order to, for one side of the mind's independent, sort of dominant and parent function to cope with its local inferior function, to be able to actually sort of, I've sort of tried to explain this as a developmental tool, which I call sort of perfecting the vanity, which is that what you should try to do is try to incorporate an inferior function into a dominant function and let it actually cut away at that dominant function, so that this circuit can sort of have it be integrated into this, so that, well, so that this will sort of change its tune in some sense. Because in some sense, I think the parent function is somewhat downstream of these things, but it will also take its own liberties. So that, I mean, the parent function has its own, let's say, scope of overreach, but the dominant function, I think, is a huge source of its toxic overreach. And the only true antidote, I think, for the dominant functions is to sort of force the dominant function to incorporate the inferior function's insights over even over its own child function. That it has to sort of try to equally balance this, because then in some sense I think that's how you get an actual, because I mean at some point you need this dominant function to be reasonable enough that your subconscious is no longer primed to be evil, because this is kind of the source of the prime evil that was imported from the sacred contract and the primal hurt, which still continues to be a problem if you want to actually broach if you want to try to break the secret contract, or sorry, the sacred contract. But I think the sin is in some sense the sacred contract, or you could say that one of the signers of the sacred contract is this child function, and the child function is itself also the primal hurt, because just even talking about the dimension that corresponds to the superego's child function, that will kind of, I don't know if I can generalize all the things that I'm saying so badly, but I just know that it's a very sore thing, because it really indicts the inferior function quite badly, especially even if you're trying to take responsibility and stuff like that. It's just a very sore point, enough to sort of just bring you back into a kind of unconscious monotony of just languishing in the status quo. But if you can kind of sort of take on the sin of the world and be aspirational in your responsibility, in terms of having that responsibility reincarnate or translate as this cognitive function, then you can actually work towards it. You can reclaim, because as you reclaim this, I think the unclean spirits are coming out of the other things. But anyway, so I'm repeating myself. I should be talking about the sides of the mind. Okay, so now the unconscious side of the mind is probably conceptually the hardest thing to talk about, because all of these other things, the unconscious and the superego, are very thematically similar in some sense, but in some sense this is happening inside your mind, and in some sense it also includes metaphysical grammar. Like the superego is like, you could say that you have full access to this. You have full access to the superego. it's happening inside you, even if like a lot of the structure of the mind itself is almost like an a priori metaphysical experience that you didn't choose, but I would say it's integral to your internal locus of control. Subconscious also integral to your internal locus of control, except maybe some portion of it that has an imprint of the unconscious. So if you've created a perspectival framework within your subconscious that is modeled on the unconscious, then that's maybe an exception to what I just said. But the subconscious is capable of also contending an internal locus of control. And the ego almost naturally is just kind of an internal locus of control. And it also kind of, it perhaps even inherits that bias from its ontological development being seeded from the superego. Or maybe you could say it's simultaneous to the superego, but the superego, I believe, is somewhat sort of, I mean, was almost the first mover in at least creating this contract. Perhaps the ego and the superego exist in a state of innocence at some point, perhaps. I mean, I don't want to generalize my experience too much, because I mean, I can actually remember this point of innocence when I was very, very young, and also when I was in the womb. I claim to have memories of, I claim to have very vivid memories of, and also, you know, and I remember my thoughts quite vividly, even from ages and ages ago, which is terrible because I also have memory problems about events in my life, sort of in more recent events. So anyway, I'm a very complicated person, but let me not get sidetracked. The unconscious side of the mind is not so internal, it's external. This is almost like the realm of the external locus of control. And so this is a huge problem for integration, because, and the thing is here is that it also has this question over here that terminally ends with the inferior function. So there's a lot of sort of things to sort of creep in here to keep one sort of languishing in. So I think that you could put the Keegan stages onto this quite well. I think superego is like Keegan stage 1, the subconscious is Keegan stage 2, the unconscious is Keegan stage 3, the ego is Keegan stage 4, and Keegan stage 5 would basically be the integration between the ego and the superego. That would be Keegan stage 5. Okay. And I think, you know, Keegan stage, everyone says that sort of, you know, Keegan stage 3.5 is where a lot of people are stuck in their sort of nihilism. So that would maybe link to the foundation of the ego, is too sort of stuck into an unconscious framework. I actually think that a lot of what people are describing when they say Keegan stage 3.5, even I very much disagree with Keegan stage. Keegan's description of Keegan stage 5, I think, is yeah. So we probably have a very different model of self-actualization, but I think that I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember all my thoughts about this. I've got lots of recordings bitching about this and making this kind of critique, but essentially I think that these people are actually stuck sort of around here, that they're stuck in Keegan stage 2 actually, and they actually have, I mean, I'm not the only person to speculate this, that essentially that the Keegan stages are not like you graduate and then you forget about them. They persist and they need to continually grow as you integrate with more other things. And so essentially if you have a Keegan stage 3.5 problem and you're stuck in Keegan stage 3.5 or nihilism or whatever, I think the problem is really in your perspectival framing of the unconscious, is why you're stuck, not being able to have the propositional latitude of stuff. But anyway, just an aside, but yeah, let me just talk about the other problems of the unconscious side of the mind. So I think that this is where like a lot of spiritual bullshit gets sort of injected into a lot of sort of theories, because you can really, if you can oversimplify things, but there are also other complexities which I haven't even started to go into, because there are a lot of things about cognition. I mean, I mean, it's actually a shame that I'm talking about this stuff first. I should not be talking about. I should be talking about Metagram first, because that gives perhaps a much more firm technical system that is sort of, this is a kind of very organic kind of holistic kind of system, whereas the actual how participation works in the world has to do with how thought translates into psychology, and then how yeah, I mean, sorry, I haven't worked out how to talk about this decently, I guess. But essentially, the problem is that you there's a natural tendency towards conflating things that shouldn't be conflated, and you can kind of make internal locus of control problems, psychological problems, into behavioral problems, which so it's like, is the problem inside of me, or is the problem with someone in my environment that needs to be dealt with? So should I apply judgment to somebody else, or should I try to be better for everyone, or for my own condition, or something like that? So at what point do you participate, and what point do you kind of internally participate within your own psychology, or something like that? And in some sense, the thing is that the unconscious side of the mind, I've got it written here as your sense of do, as opposed to the superego, which is what you are doing. So doing, I guess this is also kind of paradoxical. So like, what you tell yourself you do, you have to do something within a narrative. And how oversimplified your narrative is, or how general your narrative is, how you define your own action, means that you have to look at yourself from some kind of framework that is beyond your own psychology. So you have to create a narrative about yourself, a plot about yourself, or at least a way of judging yourself from a third person perspective. So participation is all about like what you think the third person is seeing. And this is also like, this is an integral part of language. I mean, language itself deals with this problem directly in some sense, because you don't utter things as a first person stream of consciousness. You language them in conventions and in grammar that facilitates communication, which means that there's at least a second person that's part of that framework. But if you have a first person and you have a second person, you end up also creating a third person voice, or at least the potential of one, which I would say is essentially some kind of amalgamation, the royal we. And I'm probably bastardizing some sort of English teachers category system, and I'm somewhat talking slightly off the cuff without proper jargon and technical, but essentially, I mean, I've had to deal with this problem in constructing my, so like sometimes I'll say the long form of dimension one is what will be, but it's also what I've also framed it as what things will be like, to try to kind of turn it into a noun. But sort of, because I mean, when I say the thought form of what things will be, I just mean any thought that contains that sentiment or that style of grammar, that tone of grammar. So like, and I've already said that any object will have some element of what will be in it, because that's the definition of dimension one. So if you have an idea about the future, that is an expression of what will be, or any idea will be an expression of what will be, any idea. And so, it's interesting that the first two dimensions of psychological reality are, in some sense, purely internal, although they can be projected as having external correlates or material symbols or representations. Anyway, let me not get too esoteric or jump around in too much of a strange way, but so just to have a sense of what you are do, or to have a sense for what you do, or you have to have some kind of third person medium or perspective. Now, in some sense, I think that this is all a narcissist has. I think narcissists can only see things from the unconscious perspective. They don't have their own independent perspective. Or if they do, it's only sort of to produce iterations of introjective objects, essentially. They're just sort of puppets or sort of vessels. But anyway, so a living subconscious, in some sense, probably has a model within its own framing of the ego as its key for its own independence. And so, sort of the life of the ego is perhaps reflected within the subconscious in a healthy subconscious to some degree. And obviously the subconscious then can also be more complicated, because in some sense the subconscious is going to have an ego framework, an ego perspective, it's going to have an unconscious perspective, and it's going to perhaps have its own perspective of its own sort of sandbox, where it can sort of try to mix and match and create new frameworks and sort of test bench its own potential frameworks. So the subconscious has this independent sort of fluidity about itself. And then, but not so if it's imprinted on an unconscious that feels completely subjugated or relegated, and so if the subconscious perspective has internalized an external locus of control, or actually frames everything as being within the subconscious, that what you do is a god unto itself, and is an objective criterion of some reductive universal matrix of some fatalism, determinism, or some monistic causal essentialism, you know, that maybe there's some kind of unimatrix of logic, or unimatrix of materialism, or unimatrix of temporal determinism, or fatalism, or, you know, sort of, you know, so God can sort of be infused within what you do, or something like that. Any kind of authoritarian concept or totalitarian concept can be infused in what you do. You know, if you have a complete narrative within the unconscious, a totalitarian narrative, and that is what your subconscious has imprinted on, more so than the ego, then you have no independent, you've kind of locked away your independence. And this is how people go down sort of reductive rabbit holes. And I've actually explored that concept quite nicely when I was talking to Emmanuel in a live stream, in the second live stream. I think we talked about some psychology stuff where somewhat dovetails with this. But and you can see that these people are just, you know, they're just completely governed by this perspective. They're just completely overpowered by it, and they can't graduate from it. And this, I mean, I think, so Keegan calls this Keegan stage 3.5 or something like that. But I think the problem is actually in the subconscious, it's not in the unconscious. Okay. And in some sense also, I think that when Keegan is describing what he calls Keegan stage 5, I think he's actually describing a very juvenile type of person. And I've met these people, you know, like you can meet these people. They're one of 5 people in the world who understands the classical, oh man, I can't even remember how to phrase it. You know, I think they call it the classical view of physics, or sort of the integrated. I mean, all these people believe in all these objective frameworks, all these narratives, and how they are layered. You know, so you have quantum mechanics, and above that you have you know, I guess subatomic particle physics has kind of got quantum mechanics involved with it as well. And then above that you've got sort of nuclear physics, and you know, sort of you know, just elementary particle physics, which I guess can also, and then you've got sort of yeah, and you just keep on going up and up and up on all these different layers. And then, you know, and they have all these interesting, you know, that because there are lots of technical reductive things that you can use to aggregate even large parts of scientific hypotheses, because it's all just about modeling things. But you know, they've completely lost the plot in terms of actual understanding and reality and truth seeking. It doesn't just, as long as it can be modeled inverted commas scientifically, that's all that matters to them. Never mind the fundamental incongruence. If it's incongruence, it's just a different layer, and you know, each layer has its own sort of particular magisterium. It's anyway, sorry, I could have described that a bit better, but that's kind of what Keegan stage 5 thinks it is that, well, you know, as good as you are at kind of importing different frameworks and, let's say, leveraging the right narrative at the right time, and then playing a useful role within that narrative arena which is being invoked by you and masterfully deployed, or something like that. That is what he thinks Keegan stage 5 is. And in some sense, I think it's such a juvenile way of even defining Keegan stage 5, that the only people that get away with it are people that basically are institutionally protected. They have some accolades, they have some piece of paper on the wall, and so then they get permission from society to perform their wizardry, essentially, to perform their sophistry. and and they can count themselves sort of very prominent and influential and important, powerful people, and it's all based on what I would say in some sense is integrating with the social conventional order. It's a kind of exaltation of a kind of group consensus or something like that, and it's really about being comfortably positioned within some idea that society is a monolith of some integrated power structure or set of hierarchies or something like that. And so I don't want to perhaps overshoot the mark too much. Look, there are some people who definitely seem to be mature in that. I mean, I've met people that are Keegan stage 5, and I will agree that they have, some of them at least, not all of them, but some of them have reached a level that I do consider certainly more developed and preferable, as it were. But they're interesting kind of. It's very bad to make blanket generalizations, even ones that I've just tried to carefully avoid making, but I'll just say that a lot of these people, they get into a state where they are capable of being very honest in their introspection. They're capable of, that you can ask them questions, but they've kind of, the reason why they've been able to mature and develop and integrate with certain systems of power is because they've actually developed a different kind of nihilism, where they've learned to tolerate their own question, and I'm actually referring to this question. They've learned to tolerate this, and it's actually been a golden thread, so sort of the woman that takes the child to be born. They've actually worked out that mechanism they've discovered that psychological mechanism, and they've used that mechanism to integrate and revamp a lot of their cognitive they've wiped out their cognitive dissonance to a good portion. But that doesn't mean that they've wiped out, in some sense, maybe I'm contradicting myself, they haven't wiped out all their cognitive dissonance, or they've massaged their cognitive dissonance towards creating a Unitarian monolith around something. And it's not about fixing this. It's about creating sort of a Tower of Babel, potentially. And they know that they have a Tower of Babel, and they know that it runs out, and they know that that's not good enough. But they're not looking for a solution to that problem. And that's an interesting kind of apathy, because in some sense they have learned to tolerate this question, and they've learned to use that mechanism to fuel the development of maturity, essentially. But I don't know how to put it. I mean, I have basically described what I wanted to say, but they are kind of stunted. They are in a limbo of a kind, but it's a very internal limbo. It's not an external limbo. You can call it maybe a kind of lukewarm something, but anyway. And actually, I would even argue that the problem that they have is not even described within the metatype. Maybe this is actually a wonderful segue. The problem that they have is in Metagram at that point. They don't have a metatype problem anymore, or they have enough metatype insights, but their stumbling block is in Metagram, is in the contents of these emotional tones, because they don't know about they don't have a model of cognitive mechanics. And so this is just like a kind of these wires, and the string is kind of binding them into sort of managing, sustaining this and managing this, which is probably also a responsible and necessary thing to do. This needs very careful. I mean, perhaps I don't even know all the mechanics about this in terms of actual therapy. But they probably are also lacking what I stated about this. So they have accumulated some responsibility into this, but they have no view to incorporate this with this. So they might be missing that piece, and maybe they could actually fix that, but they might also just be mesmerized by this stuff, by these connections, by these metagram emotional tones, which is occupying them, and they are kind of left in the limbo of a question. But they have that one ability to kind of recapitulate their ego to some degree. And in some sense, I think that some of them, I think I did discover, like, one of them or two of them, they have kind of long cycles where they have very long. So in some sense, I've often regarded the health of the false ego complex could be regarded as how often you cycle. And what I mean by cycle is that how often this sin is experienced. And the longer the cycle, the more I don't like, you're certainly going to be discombobulated if you're coming up against this constantly, because this is, you can kind of, each of these cognitive functions could be seen as a moment, and if you can just stay within the inferior functions and the dominant and the parent functions, you can kind of stay out of hot water, perhaps. But when the devotion is happening, you're perhaps going to get some agitation, like a capacitor. You're going to get some sympathetic charge, or if these things are changing things, you might get a different question. So, how is this coping? This is, I guess, this could be called either cope or responsibility. But I mean, I guess there are probably also shades of responsible coping as well. Anyway, okay.